Right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Have you ever watched an argument unfold where the two sides aren't just disagreeing, but it honestly seems like they are speaking two completely different languages? Well, today, we're decoding exactly what happens when an individual mind and a massive societal institution are operating on entirely different psychological wavelengths. We're going to look at a real-world legal case, and we're unpacking it purely through the science of how humans think, how we judge right from wrong, and how we find our purpose.
So here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the unique legal case itself. Then, we'll break down the clash of cognitive stages, move into rules versus moral principles, examine the psychosocial crisis, and finally, bring it all together with the systemic developmental mismatch. Section 1. A unique legal case. Let's establish the ground facts of the real-world conflict that's going to anchor our whole deep dive today.
And here's the core question we're trying to answer. What actually happens when an individual's mind simply outgrows the system they live in? We're going to examine this conflict entirely through the lens of objective psychological frameworks. So rather than getting bogged down in the politics, we're looking at the structural maturity of the minds involved. You know, what literally happens when a highly developed person hits the rigid boundaries of a system that was designed for a totally different level of psychological complexity.
Let's trace the timeline for our case study. We're looking at Dr. Chen. He's a brilliant scientist. Now, between 2019 and 2022, he simply retweeted various articles and images online. That's it. But then, in September 2022, he was arrested for, quote, picking quarrels. And by April 2023, he was handed a 20-month prison sentence for allegedly spreading false information and disturbing public order. Now, on the surface, sure, it looks like a standard legal timeline. But underneath all that, there is a massive, fascinating psychological clash going on.
Think about the profound disconnect between these two parties. I mean, it's wild. In his defense, Dr. Chen actually utilized advanced physics, network theory, the CAP theorem, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem. He was literally using math to argue that his retweets couldn't have disrupted network order. And the institution? Well, they responded with rigid, standardized rules, just a super strict binary of right and wrong, basically saying the rules were broken, end of story. They were talking right past each other. But why?
That brings us to Section 2, the clash of cognitive stages. To figure out why they were speaking completely different languages, we need to bring in our first framework, Jean Piaget's stages of cognitive development.
Now, Piaget famously mapped out how our brains mature. The highest standard stage he found is called formal operational, but later on, psychologists identified something even further, post-formal thought. Basically, post-formal thought lets an adult step back and evaluate multiple, often conflicting, systemic truths all at the exact same time. It means being totally okay with accepting uncertainty, understanding highly complex models, and recognizing that absolute black and white binary truths, yeah, they are extremely rare in complex systems.
And this framework perfectly, I mean perfectly, explains our legal case. The individual, Dr. Chen, is clearly utilizing high-level abstract reasoning. That is, post-formal thought in action. He's analyzing the whole situation as a complex system. The institution, on the other hand, is firmly anchored in what Piaget would call the concrete operational stage. They are relying on direct rules, demanding immediate obedience, and clinging to a strict binary of right versus wrong. It literally cannot process the abstract ambiguity that Dr. Chen is presenting to them.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that this isn't just a simple disagreement over the facts. Actually, scratch that, it's more like an asymmetry of rational maturity. The two sides are fundamentally mismatched in their very cognitive structures. One side is using systemic, theoretical reasoning, and the other's just using punitive, rigid, experience-based judgment. It creates a complete intellectual fault line.
All right, Section 3, Rules versus Moral Principles. Let's shift our psychological lens a bit, from how these subjects think to how they actually judge right and wrong.
Enter Lawrence Kohlberg and his theory of moral development. Kohlberg argued that our morality actually develops in distinct stages, and post-conventional morality is the absolute highest stage. Someone operating at this level doesn't just blindly follow the law. They act based on universal concepts, things like academic freedom, human dignity, and historical responsibility. They don't just ask, what's the rule? They ask the much harder question, is the rule actually just?
When you map this out, the moral mismatch is just incredibly stark. Subject A, the individual, is operating on those universal ethical principles.
He's arguing for truth and historical legacy, which sits right up there at Kohlberg's stages 5 and 6. But subject B, the institution, they're operating way down at stages 3 and 4, which is conventional morality. For the institution, the absolute highest moral objective is simply enforcing obedience, maintaining the status quo, and upholding the written rule, completely devoid of any philosophical nuance.
A system stuck at this conventional stage acts out of a deep, fundamental need for certainty and control. It's hyper-focused on immediate consequences, it relies entirely on established authority, and it views maintaining social order as the absolute highest good. So for them, complex nuance isn't an interesting debate. It's viewed as a direct, literal threat. Moving on to Section 4, the psychosocial crisis. For our third dimension, we're going to turn to the psychologist Erikson to examine how this conflict impacted life purpose and identity.
So Erikson proposed that we go through these major psychosocial crises at different points in our lives. And in middle adulthood, the big crisis is generativity versus stagnation. Generativity is that deep inner drive to create, to share knowledge, and to leave a meaningful legacy for the next generation. Stagnation, on the flip side, is that terrible feeling of being stuck, unproductive, and restricted. At this specific stage in life, a highly developed individual is biologically and psychologically hardwired to share what they know.
And what we see here is a fierce collision of those exact drives. The individual's intense need to create a historical legacy, which we saw when he shared those academic articles and later wrote a massive defense document while in prison. That is a textbook, classic example of generativity. But this directly collided with an institution functioning on role-based stagnation. The system was desperately trying to force the individual back into a compliant, quiet little box. It violently interrupted his natural psychological growth process.
Consider the idea that true maturity is not about conforming to the world, but understanding it with one's own light. That beautifully captures the individual's ultimate defense mechanism here. When the environment physically locked him in a box and blocked his normal path of contributing to society, his mind performed this incredibly resilient pivot. He shifted his focus to a historical timeline, preserving his core identity as a seeker of truth, even from behind bars.
And that brings us to Section 5, a systemic developmental mismatch. Now let's bring all three of these psychological frameworks together to reveal the ultimate structural phenomenon that's at play here.
The really big takeaway for us today is that this whole situation, it isn't about subjective opinions or left versus right politics. It is an objective, structural incompatibility that psychologists call a developmental mismatch. It happens when an institution, one built to handle the average predictable baseline, simply cannot process a mind that has evolved well past it.
When we bring all these dimensions together, the complete picture is undeniable. Cognitively, you've got abstract post-formal thought clashing with binary concrete rules. Morally, it's universal principles versus strict, unbending obedience. And psychosocially, it's that drive for generativity up against enforced stagnation. We are literally looking at a complex mind facing off against an institution that just lacks the developmental vocabulary to even understand it. And sadly, when those two forces meet, the rigid system often uses its power to just crush what it cannot comprehend.
An individual in cognitive and moral adulthood speaking to a system that remains structurally adolescent. That thought right there perfectly synthesizes the absolute tragedy of this case study. It's a highly matured mind that's being systemically repressed by the exact environment that is supposed to foster it. It's honestly like watching a university professor try to debate advanced philosophy with a system that only understands the rules of a middle school playground. The result is inevitably a complete breakdown of communication and, more often than not, an unjust application of force.
So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. While we've only looked at one specific legal case today, this kind of psychological mismatch, it happens everywhere. I'd invite you to look at the institutions in your own life. Think about your workplace, your local government, or your educational systems, and really question their psychological maturity. Are they designed to foster post-formal thought and universal principles, or are they stuck just demanding mere obedience? Thank you so much for exploring this framework with me today. Keep questioning and keep learning.